Hello, looking here at Nine Inch Nails' first album, Pretty Hate Machine, which I picked up secondhand 2 years ago now. This was a little bit more expensive. This was not from a charity shop, this was from a secondhand music shop, and I think it was about $7 or $8. So it's still not anything crazy, but a little bit more expensive than the things I usually get. So you can see he's got the sticker there. Gotta get something, maybe like a razor blade or something to get that off because that kind of annoys me. But this came out in 1989 on TVT. So his first, Nine Inch Nails, which is basically just Trent Reznor, or was at this time at least, um, wrote and recorded this by himself before he had formed a band, or at least a touring band, and he got a record deal with TVT. Doesn't sound like it was a very good relationship because he pretty soon after the release of this album he was already trying to get out of the record contract, or I don't know is that all the ins and outs of what went on with that, but interestingly that this particular copy that I have doesn't say TVT anywhere on it, and it actually says 1991 through Interscope. So Interscope is the label he went with after TVT, which he released pretty downward spiral and I think broken as well, the EP he did with Interscope as well, and Fred, like he had Nothing Records, which is his imprint on Interscope, which he signed Marilyn Manson to. But anyway, my point is that this doesn't say TVT. So what I think happened here, this is just from my guess, is that this when this came out in 1989 on TVT, because TVT was an independent, it was released and distributed to big markets like the US and Britain and parts of Europe, but it didn't get a deal or a distribution whatever in Australia and New Zealand, and that when this did go on to be quite successful, it sold pretty decently. Apparently it sold 3 million copies in the US up until today. Like, of course, that's across over 30 years of time, but still, for an album that kind of sounds like this, I was quite surprised it sold 3 million copies in one country. But that's pretty good. But when it got some success and he signed with Interscope, I guess there was some sort of stipulation in the deal that allowed them to take this album and distribute it in the Australian market, Australasian market, Australia and New Zealand, because it says 1991, which is 2 years after it was released in the US. 1991 Interscope Records. And I've said before, I don't know all the ins and outs of record labels, and it gets so complicated where you can have a deal with one label, even if it's an international label, like whatever, Warner's or Universal, but it's only for one market, and that you can sign with different labels in different markets, and then there's distribution deals, and it's very complicated and convoluted. You can understand why so many artists do get themselves into really bad record contract situations, because you need someone, a professional who exclusively deals with this industry to understand it and to tell you whether it's a good deal or not. So anyway, it's I think kind of unique in that sense that it's not a TVT issuing per se. It's 2 years after it was initially released. Apparently the TVT pressing of this went out of print, and it was reissued on another label in 2005 with a label I hadn't heard of, a Ryko disc or something like that, which doesn't sound like famous at all. And then it has been reissued as like a 25th year or 20th anniversary one, with bonus tracks and all. And they redid the cover, they changed the color and stuff. But I haven't seen that around. But anyway, the covering, I always thought that image was a microphone. You know those old styly microphones, kind of like from like the 50s, where they were like, you'd see like on late night talk shows like Letterman and stuff. He has like a microphone on his desk, and it's like metal, and it's kind of got like that, I guess, like kind of, what would you call that? Kind of like grating across it. I always thought it was that. You look at it closely, it's not. Apparently, it's a manipulated picture of no, kind of some kind of fan turbines, but it's been changed to make it look like a rib cage. But I didn't get that out of it at all when I saw it. But anyway, what do I think about this album? I'm a big fan of Nine Inch Nails, and I have been since the mid '90s, since I was a kid. I mean, the first thing I ever saw of theirs was their video for March of the Pigs on TV when I would have been about 13, I guess, 13 or 14, which is the one where it's just a single shot, very low budget live performance of the song, and they're all going crazy playing it. And I thought it was quite funny. He pushed over the microphone stand, and they had roadies running during the video while the video is filming to kind of put the mic stand back up as you would see at a live concert. And I love that song, March of the Pigs, the first time I heard it. I still like it today, but kind of jumping ahead there. So this album, I didn't hear this until quite a bit later. I think the first song I heard of this was Head Like a Hole, and I heard that probably the late 90s. I went back and found some of this stuff and downloaded it, I think. So what do we got on here? We got Head Like a Hole, which is one of their more famous songs. You know, if you go see them live, that's almost guaranteed they're going to play that. I like that song. It's a great song. Terrible Lie, another great song. Down in It. So speaking about this, I'm kind of touching on that song, but speaking about the album as a whole. I said in another video that people, when they talk about Nine Inch Nails, they categorize them, especially their early work, as industrial rock, metal, but it kind of isn't. Like it definitely has industrial elements, but it's got a much more pop, traditional rock format when you compare it to other industrial things. That song there, Down in It, has very, very, very clearly been, let's say politely, influenced and politely ripped off from Skinny Puppy. And Skinny Puppy is a band that I've listened to a bit over the last 20 years, I guess, but not a whole lot, because they're quite harsh and abrasive, as a lot of those industrial bands tend to be, that I can only really take them in small doses. The song there that he's drawn influence from, Dig It, is actually probably one of my favorite Skinny Puppy songs. There's a couple of versions, but I don't know what they name it. Is it maybe one of the remix versions or something? But if you listen to that, and actually I'd say Terrible Lie has a bit of a lot of the songs, the industrial aspect, it sounds like he's taken from bands like Skinny Puppy, quite wholesale. But then the thing that made Nine Inch Nails and has always made them unique is that he blends that with his own music sensibility, which seems to be more traditional. You know, he's talked about, you read a lot of interviews or seen a lot of interviews with him, and he talks about his youth. You know, he liked pretty straight ahead bands. He was a big fan of David Bowie, but particularly of Pink Floyd's The Wall. So he's a huge fan of that. So he was not necessarily a big fan of kind of experimental musicians in his youth. If you also listen to some of the stuff he was involved with before this album, so he was in a few bands in Cleveland before he recorded this album. So he grew up in rural Pennsylvania. He left there for the big city, the big lights of Cleveland, and he worked in a recording studio. And if you look on YouTube, there's a few bands he was involved with. To what degree, I don't know. But the one that you can see him in a video quite clearly, I think it's called Slam Bamboo. He's the keyboardist in that band. There's another one called Exotic Birds. There's a couple of other ones as well. And you listen to them and they sound very... and I'm not saying he wasn't the principal songwriter or the lead man of any of these bands, but just the music that he was involved with these bands sounds like straight ahead kind of 80s synth pop in the vein of the Human League or I don't know, like any of those kind of new wave, new romantic, new wave type bands. Um, you hear a little bit of quite a lot of also New Orderish stuff, and that's what, yeah, I think New Order is a big influence on him and on this album. It's like he's taken the synthness of New Order and the kind of traditional new songwriting formatting of New Order, but then put it some more of the harsher elements of industrial like bands like Skinny Puppy, and then his own stuff, and it's kind of that amalgamation is what makes the sound of this album. And as long as I'm coming up with saying this as original stuff, this is stuff I've read, and I've also thought myself over the last, however long I've been listening to this album. The rest of the track listings, you got Sanctified, it's okay. To be honest, I think that's a bit one note, that song. Something I Can Never Have. Now we start getting into, I don't know, how would you call it? Teenagerish lyrics. I think it's this one. Is it this one? No, it's this one and Something I Can Never Have, and That's What I Get. They sound like they've been ripped from the diary of a moody teenager who's just broken up with his first girlfriend. And I'm not, yeah, I've been there. Who hasn't? I guess that's why I can recognize it. But I don't know how old he was when he wrote this album. Actually, I might just check that. He was born in 1965, and he recorded this in 89, so he was 24. By my early 20s, I would have been very embarrassed to write something like he wrote on, particularly the one where he says, "Oh, you taught me to kiss," which I think that's what I get. So if I just quickly got a page here with the lyrics on it. Just when everything was making sense, you took away all my self-confidence. Now all that I've been hearing must be true. I guess I'm not the only boy for you. That sounds almost like very pop music lyricish. Early Depeche Mode, before Depeche Mode became good. How could you turn me into this after you? This is the lyric that even the first time I heard this, I laughed at. After you taught me how to kiss. But in the song, there's a beat, like a pause, and then he says, you, like as in, you just taught me how to kiss you. Because if you took away the you, it would be even worse. You taught me how to kiss. But it was specifically kissing her. Or him, I don't know. I told you I'd never say goodbye. Now I'm slipping. Oh, that's right. Now I'm slipping on the tears you made me cry. Now, I have read an interview with him, and I was looking specifically for this last night, but I couldn't find it, where he said that this was in retrospect, though, so it's easy for him to say this now, but he did say a little bit after the album was released, maybe a couple of years after, he said, yeah, when I listen to it now, it sounds very immature, but I thought that at the time, but I just used those lyrics anyway because they were real, which I can respect that. And really, I don't know. Nine Inch Nails, as much as I love them, have always had a cheesy element. That's kind of that's what I found with the people who don't like them. They kind of sometimes they can't look past the cheese. But I've always been able to do that. Those lyrics though are a bit much. What else we got? I kind of wanted Sin. Now Sin, I think Sin was one of the. I think the singles they had were Hit Like a Hole, Sin, and Down in It. And Sin has got, it's very of its time, the sound, but it's at the same time, that's not a bad thing. It's very 80s synth sounding. In some ways, like you could have seen the direction he could have gone more if he had wanted to with, I think, Sin. He could have moved it more into that synth rock industrial type sound but he didn't. He went as he did towards when he made Broken and Downward Spiral, which is kind of away from that sound, because I guess that sound did kind of peter out in popular music in the late '80s anyway. So um, the only time and Ring Finger, Ring Fingers, I like Ring Finger. It's a good song. Um, Actually, was Terrible Lie a single as well? Maybe Terrible Lie was a single as well. I'm not sure. You can see there, you got 4 producers. Himself, Flood. I've talked about Flood before. Flood is a great producer. If you look at his page, his Discogs page or whatever, a page of some of the acts he's worked, he's just worked with so many great acts and quite a range of acts as well. Like, he is associated quite a lot with the sound, with the Nine Inch Nails kind of industrial kind of sound. Like, he was also involved with U2 when they kind of switched to that, I guess. There was some not really industrial, but the sound they went with Achtung Baby and Zooropa in the 90s, he was involved with that as well, at least as a mixer. I'm not sure if he was the engineer, I'm not sure if he was the producer, but Depeche Mode, Nitzareb, Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, Erasure, Depeche Mode again, Ministry, like I said, U2, Zooropa, the Smashing Pumpkins, but also artists like PJ Harvey, New Order. I saw this, one of my favorite, probably my favorite PJ Harvey album, Let England Shake. He was the mixer and the engineer on that, which I wouldn't have picked from listening to it, but it's pretty awesome that he was, because that's a brilliant, brilliant album. More recently, Interpol, Foals, Goldfrapp, Orbital. A lot of great artists. So also, you see there other producers, Keith LeBlanc. I've heard of him, but I don't know much about him. Adrian Sherwood, John Fryer. He did a lot of production work as well. You see his name pop up a lot. He worked with This Mortal Coil. I think he was involved with them, and he's produced lots of other things like Wire. I think he did something from them. He worked a bit with Depeche Mode as well. But obviously he's kind of chosen to work with guys in that world, that sonic world. Yeah. Let's quickly look at the insert booklet thingy. It's going to get stuck there. So we've got the lyrics, some liner notes, probably. Nine Inch Nails is Trent Reznor. Yes, it is. So you see Chris Vrenna and Richard Patrick, they were very, very minor involvement in this album. Like, I think I've seen on some of the explanation that they just did like tiny little bits and pieces, like literally like a sound here or there on a song. I guess that's Trent. Doesn't actually look like him very much. And then they've got a symbol, such an awesome symbol that they'd be able to keep until today. Over 30 years of exactly the same. Such a simplistic but effective, bold, instantly recognizable. So yeah, it's a good album. I think you can really hear with Broken, he takes one step, and then with Downward Spiral, it's like he completely, found what he was looking for sound-wise. If you know what I mean. Like, when you're young, you go through so many periods of, musical influences. And if you're a musician, I can admit, like someone like him, you'd be hearing so much new stuff and incorporating it and being influenced by it. And when you're making your first album, it would be kind of like quite a mishmash of bits and pieces of things you're trying to get out. But then I feel when you got to the Downward Spiral, it was like everything had fixed in place exactly where it needed to be to make that album. And then even more so the Fragile. The Fragile, I feel, is like his, magnum opus, or the perfect record, as much as it could be. There was like nothing left on the table with that. I feel everything after that, he's done some good stuff after that with Teeth throughout up until today, has never reached the heights of The Fragile and Downward Spiral. I will say that some of his soundtrack work has. He works with Atticus Ross now. He's actually a full member of Nine Inch Nails, and there's his writing partner on soundtracks. They do so much soundtrack work; it's hard for me to keep up with. Like the one they won the Oscar, or was it the Oscar for that Disney one or the Pixar one? Soul. I've actually never even listened to that yet, but Gone Girl, The Social Network, um, Bird Box. The other one he did that I was listening to. Oh, the girl with one of those the books, the girl with the dragon tattoo. Brilliant, brilliant stuff. As good as anything he's done with the Nine Inch Nails, and really, that's kind of the stuff that I always liked the most with Nine Inch Nails was the textured, atmospheric sounds, which is like in this album, maybe why I don't like Sanctified so much, is because it's too just straight ahead, nothing in it. Whereas things like Sin, and even that's what I get, and the only time you listen underneath it, there's like really, you can hear the beginnings that really, like the atmospherics he does so well. Like on that song on, not wanting to skip ahead, but on Downward Spiral, Warm Place, which apparently is quite heavily influenced by David Bowie. Again, maybe ripped off from Crystal Japan, but the textures he uses in that, the synth textures, just he does that so well, and I think you hear that particularly in his soundtrack work. There's so I could talk about Trent Reznor and Nine Inch Nails for hours, but I will do other videos of the other albums, secondhand Nine Inch Nails stuff I've got here. But yeah, as a debut, I think it's a pretty great album. I wouldn't say it's anywhere near a perfect album. I'd give it a 4 out of 5, an 8 out of 10, that kind of area. But yeah, it's I guess it's interesting to hear as part of his musical evolution. It's very early in his career, he's still a young man, and it's got some really good songs, some classic songs on it that are still, part of any kind of Nine Inch Nails greatest hits collection that might be available if it were to be. Anyway, we'll leave it there. Take it easy.